All right, welcome to this first module for planning your document. My name is Dave Jackson, and I run the School of Podcasting.com. My podcast about podcasting has been downloaded over 830,000 times. Later in the course, we'll actually look at some of those stats. But I've been podcasting since 2005. And in this first month, so this is me, and this is, actually, there's a little microphone down here. Shh, it's off camera. And I like to have fun in class. And so the one thing I have to point out first is I have my notes right there. So when I'm doing this, I'm sorry that I'm not looking at you, but I'm looking at my notes. And so I'm going to relay these notes to you. And I'm glad, first of all, thank you for signing for this course. I'm going to help you avoid the common podcasting pitfalls. So the first question is, why should I even start a podcast? Well, number one, you're going to be seen as an expert. I know I do a podcast about weight loss, and the funny thing is, I'm not losing any weight. But people still ask me about questions. I'm like, look, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a trainer. I'm just a dude in the basement trying to lose weight. Because I have a podcast, people see me as an expert. If you're a company, it keeps your name, it keeps your brand in front of people. There is a Whirlpool is a company that makes washers and dryers, among many other things. And they did a podcast. Now, did they talk about washers and dryers in their podcast? No. They looked at their audience, which in this case was families, because families have a lot of laundry, and they had tips like how to make your kids brush their teeth longer and things like that. So it's a way to keep your name in front of your audience. It'll also help you increase product sales. There are numerous podcasts. One actually is about knitting, and they talk about knitting on their podcast and different tools and patterns and things like that. And they see sales jump about 20% when they mention a product on the podcast. It's going to help you understand your market. So if you are a company, I've seen companies that will use a podcast to deliver customer service information on how to use their product better or how other people are using their product and things like that. And when you start to develop this feedback with your audience, you understand your audience better, you understand how they're using the product better, you have a better connection with them. So they'll say, I wish the product did this, and with a better understanding of your product, you can then build a better product, which leads to more sales. You will actually be seen as a trusted person if you put out a podcast on a regular schedule. You can also, in some cases, if you're just doing it for fun, you will find like-minded people. I'll give you an example. There's a friend of mine, Kevin Mulrine, does a podcast about the rock band Yes from the 70s. And he has all these people now who love that band that flock around his podcast. And of course, one of the biggest benefits of podcasting is you reach a global audience. And I'll give you an example. When I first started podcasting back in 2005, I was doing a newsletter for musicians. I had about 1,200 people on that list. And I got a little bit of feedback, but not a ton. And it would go out every week. So I started taking that exact same content and put it into an audio format, then put it out as a podcast. And within 2 weeks, I got my first voicemail from Germany. Now, I'm just a guy at that point in the basement in Akron, Ohio. And here comes a guy from Germany, and I literally about fell out of my chair. It is time shifted. You'll hear that phrase a lot. That means I can record something today. Just like today, I'm recording this on March 29th, 2013. I'm here in my office, and who knows when you're watching this. It's called time-shifted content. Now, another thing I want to point out here is it will build a loyal audience, and I'm going to give you some examples here. The first one is if you go to noagendashow.com. This is a podcast by two people. One is named Adam Curry. You might remember him from MTV days. He's actually one of the guys that helped invent podcasts. And John C. Dvorak. And they have people join their night program, which is they donate $1,000 to the show. They donate $1,000 to the show. And they have, and dames, if you're a female, you can be a dame of the show. And they have tons and tons of people that donate thousands of dollars every single week to their podcast. That's actually how they make a living now. Now, how do they do that? They deliver information that you can't get anyplace else. They basically dissect the media. Keith and the Girl do a daily show. Keith is actually a stand-up comedian, and they do a daily show, and their audience is so loyal that they started off having tattoos of the Keith and the Girl logo on their body and such. They have since taken it to a new level now, and they are branding, as in branding, the logo on their arm. And I was told, I actually interviewed them, they said it's not, it's actually like a tattoo, only it's burning. It's not, it's, yeah, ow. Wouldn't do that. Scott Sigler is an author. And listen to Scott's story. He actually he wrote a book, couldn't get a publisher, and so he started recording, just reading his book out and putting it out as kind of a series like they used to do on the old radio shows. And people loved his book. They couldn't wait for the next episode to come out. So when the book was done, people had already heard the whole thing. He actually got a deal and got the book on Amazon. So he told his entire audience, hey, it's coming out on this day on Amazon. If you could buy it on that day, now think about that. If you could buy the book that you just got for free over a series of weeks, if you could buy that book in a physical format, it would be greatly appreciated. And his audience wanted to help him so much that they went out, they bought the book. It was the number 2 book, number 2, out of all books. It would have been number 1 except for this little thing called Harry Potter that was going on at the time. Think about that. The number 2 book on Amazon. That's a loyal audience. Emily Morse, you may have heard that name. She does a podcast called Sex with Emily, and she actually at one point had they found her, a radio producer found her on iTunes. They gave her a job on the radio on an FM dial, same station that Adam Carolla was on, and she actually had a radio show. Unfortunately, with radio, you do get let go on occasion when you have a new station manager come in or things like that. So she's not doing the radio thing anymore, but now she's on Bravo. She's actually on a TV show. And so her career continues to go on. Speaking of Adam Carolla, you'll hear his name a lot. He's the most downloaded podcast. And the fun thing about Adam is he was on radio. He took over for Howard Stern. And then, much like radio, he got let go. And so what did he do? He took his audience and started a podcast. Now, the great thing about that is he does it in his home and does it whenever he wants. He does it on a daily basis. But to make a long story short, his podcast continued to grow now, and he actually needed to start selling advertising on it. And you know who came to help him? That's right, the company that fired him said, hey, can we help you? Can we sell advertising on your podcast? Kind of funny. I bet that was a little bittersweet. It's estimated that he gets, on an average, about 130,000 downloads per episode. Okay? Alan Stewart does the Marketers Podcast at marketerspodcast.com, and his podcast allowed him to get to people that he couldn't. He was trying to market to a certain company, couldn't get past the gatekeeper. Yeah, that's right. The CEO heard his podcast while he was walking on the treadmill and said, we need to bring that guy in. In fact, Alan's podcast has led him into so much business that he can't do his podcast anymore. Michael Butler does the Rock and Roll Geek Show at rockandrollgeek.com. The great thing about his podcast, he just plays music. Again, very loyal audience. He actually, at this point, I believe is the longest running podcast. He started in 2004. And he had an opportunity to interview some of his favorite musicians. One was a guy named Ginger from the Wild Hearts out of Australia. And to make a long story short, Ginger came on his show. And then later, when Ginger came to where Michael lives in San Francisco, Michael actually got to play bass in Ginger's band. How cool would that be, to be able to play with one of your heroes? And then later, Ginger did a special show in London, and he wanted Michael to play bass on it. And Michael's like, I can't really afford a trip to London. So his audience chipped in, flew him to London, put him up in one of their houses, and then flew him back. Again, loyal audience. When Oprah Winfrey wanted to do a show about grammar, where did they go to? Mignon Fogarty actually is Grammar Girl. And so she has now spun that. She was so a podcaster has been on Oprah when there wasn't a Oprah show. Chris Christensen does the Amateur Traveler podcast at amateurtraveler.com, where he occasionally receives free trips to locations so he can actually review them. He also takes photographs while he's there and then sells his prints of these photographs. Comedian Jay Moore gives away his podcast for free, but the relationship he's building with his audience is evident in the fact that he's now booking larger venues. And what's great about this is just recently, Jim Rome, who's a very famous sports caster, he had all these stations across the United States. He switched from the Fox network to CBS, and Fox needed somebody to take over. And who did they pick? That's right, they picked Jay Moore. Why? Because they heard his podcast. They also heard him take over for Jim Rome. But those are just some examples of the power of podcasting. In the next section, I'm going to explain to you why podcasting is better than radio.